Somewhere in Australia, a man picked up a telephone, called a Games Workshop store in England, confirmed that a game was in progress, and fired a weapon at a stranger's army on the other side of the planet. No travel required, no line of sight, no permission asked. And we can't find a single official document that proves this was legal. That gap between what the community swears happened and what the rulebooks can confirm isn't a weakness in this story. It's the story. Because Games Workshop, at some point during the 3rd or 4th edition of Warhammer 40,000, appears to have printed a weapon with a range of 12 to 960 inches. That is 80 feet. The table it was being played on was 4 feet wide. Players read that number, looked at each other across a folding table in a hobby store somewhere in suburban England or New South Wales, and arrived at a perfectly reasonable conclusion. If the range is 960 inches, and there's no rule saying the target has to be in the same building, then technically, they were right. The rules, as written, said nothing to stop them. This is a field report on the Deathstrike Missile Launcher, on what it did to competitive tabletop gaming, on what the community did with it, and on why the greatest moments in the history of Warhammer 40,000 were never written in any Black Library novel. They were improvised by players who read the codex too literally and refused to stop. The Deathstrike Missile Launcher is, on paper, the most dramatic weapon in the Imperial Guard arsenal. A single-shot ballistic missile. It fires once per game, and that's it. One launch, one devastation event. Then the launcher sits there for the rest of the battle doing nothing. According to community archives on DakkaDakka, the older codex described this weapon's range as 12 to 960 inches, though it's worth noting that the source specifies this appeared in the descriptive part of the codex, rather than the binding rules statline, which tells you something about how the community chose to read it. A minimum arming distance of 12 inches, sensible enough for a ballistic weapon, and a maximum range that wasn't really a maximum at all. 960 inches is more than 13 times the length of a standard table. It's the distance from one side of a shopping center to the other. As a practical ceiling on the weapon's reach, it was functionally meaningless. Games Workshop has never published a FAQ entry, an errata, or a tournament ruling that directly addresses what happens when a player points that 960-inch range at a game in another country. The research record, multiple passes across forum archives, codex databases, and official GW documentation found nothing. No clarification, no ruling. No official acknowledgement that the exploit existed at all. What it found instead were the stories. The actual firing mechanic made the whole situation funnier. Before the Deathstrike Missile Launcher could launch, the controlling player had to satisfy a special rule called "The Hour is Nigh." Roll a d6, add the current battle round number. If the total equals 8 or more, you may fire. If not, you wait. Try again next turn. Work through the math. In round 1, you need a 7 or higher on a single 6-sided die. The maximum face on a d6 is 6. The weapon can't fire in round 1. Mathematically impossible. In round 2, you need a 6, roughly a 17% chance. Round 3 gives you a 33% chance. Round 4, 50%. Round 5 gets you to 67%. Standard games of Warhammer 40,000 run 5 to 6 rounds, meaning round 5 is the final or penultimate round in most games. Across an entire game, playing the probabilities correctly, there's a real and non-trivial chance the missile never leaves the launcher at all. Games Workshop had printed a weapon with a range of 960 inches that might not fire once. The community's response to this wasn't frustration, it was philosophy. Somewhere, the exact source is debated, and the research record traces a nearly identical sentiment to a Reddit thread in a Death Guard community rather than an Imperial Guard one, with the phrasing, "Not a list for winning, but for sending a message." Someone arrived at a pickup game with a list built around 7 Deathstrike missile launchers, looked across the table at the inevitable question of why, and answered with something to the effect of, "It's not about winning, it's about sending a message." Whether the 7 launcher list itself is a documented incident or the community's way of illustrating a philosophy it already held is, frankly, unresolved. No primary source for it has been located. What is documented is that the sentiment exists, that it circulates in Imperial Guard communities, and that it fits. 7 launchers. 7 single-shot, potentially never-firing ballistic missiles. The mandatory HQ to make it a legal army list. Whatever points were left over, filled out by obligation rather than intent. The list wasn't optimized. It wasn't efficient. It was a declaration of values in detachment miniature form. And the sentiment behind it, whether it originated with a Guard player or migrated across community lines from somewhere else, landed so cleanly among Imperial Guard players that it might as well be codex text. The Deathstrike Missile Launcher had found its philosophy. It was never about winning. Now back to Australia. The mechanics of the cross-store phone call were straightforward. The Deathstrike Missile Launcher's range, whether binding rules text or descriptive flavor read as rules by the community, had no practical ceiling in the older interpretive consensus. A game table is a legal battlefield. A Games Workshop store contains game tables. Nothing in the rules specified the target had to be in the same physical location as the attacker. Players in the pre-8th edition era, broadly before 2017, began testing those boundaries. Community posts describe it as a known practice. Call a store, confirm a game is in progress, announce you're firing the Deathstrike Missile Launcher, roll your dice, and report the result. The receiving store acknowledges the hit. Play continues. A Reddit thread in r/the Astra Militarum captures the memory in hedged but unmistakable terms. There have been stories of games where one store fired a Deathstrike missile at another store and hit a random table affecting the game there. Plural, stories. A pattern, not a single incident. The Australia to UK version is the most dramatic recorded account. An intercontinental ballistic strike executed via telephone, targeting a stranger's army in a country on the other side of the planet. No specific store has been named in any recovered source. No date has been attached to it. The players involved remain anonymous. What survives is the description of what happened and the reaction of everyone who heard about it afterward, distilled most precisely by a single comment buried in a community thread. I miss this feature. That sentence does a lot of work. It isn't nostalgia for a game mechanic. It's nostalgia for a moment in tabletop gaming culture when the rules were loose enough that a player in Sydney could decide, apparently legally, to reach across 12,000 miles of ocean and detonate a missile in someone else's hobby store. The game wasn't broken by this. According to every community account available, people loved it. One community account, unverified, with no traceable primary source, describes a player launching 4 Deathstrike missile launchers simultaneously at an army in another state, almost annihilating it and triggering a full store celebration on the firing end. The account describes everyone in the store having a celebration. The receiving store's reaction isn't recorded. The imagination fills in the gap adequately. This is worth sitting with in terms of what it reveals about who was playing Imperial Guard during this era. The army draws a specific kind of player, not necessarily the one optimizing a list the night before a tournament at 2 in the morning with a spreadsheet. More often, the one who read the codex, found the most spectacular possible interpretation of a rule, and built an entire social ritual around it. Cross-continental Deathstrike Missile Launcher strikes weren't cheating. They weren't exploits in the pejorative sense. They were celebrations of what happens when rules fail to imagine the creativity of the people playing by them. The same impulse produced the Cyclops. The Cyclops demolition vehicle is an Imperial Guard unit that functions exactly as its name suggests, a remote-controlled tracked bomb driven toward the enemy and detonated. There is no subtlety in its design. There is no secondary function. It drives forward and explodes. Its role in any competitively optimized list is, charitably, decorative. The community has at least one story about a Cyclops that justifies its entire existence as a unit. According to accounts circulated in 40K communities, no primary source chain survives to a specific forum post, so take the specifics as the texture of a real game report rather than a verified transcript. An Imperial Guard player guided his Cyclops demolition vehicle directly into the heart of an Eldar front line. Wraith Guard, Dire Avengers, half a unit of striking scorpions. An Autarch. The detonation collected all of them in a single blast. The Eldar player, according to the account, extended his hand for a handshake at the end of the game, and it was, reportedly, the softest handshake in the history of the hobby. Not angry, not a grudge. Just the handshake of a man who had been utterly destroyed by something that cost almost nothing in points, and deserved, at minimum, the acknowledgement that it had happened. The Cyclops story and the Deathstrike Missile Launcher story operate on the same frequency. Both involve Imperial Guard players finding a rule that the designers probably didn't think through completely, applying it with complete sincerity, and achieving a result that was simultaneously catastrophic and somehow entirely in the spirit of the game. Both stories end with everyone involved, winning player, losing player, watching store, agreeing that it was absolutely worth it. This is what the first rule of warfare is to have fun actually means in practice. Not as a consolation for losing, not as a shrug from someone who showed up with an unpainted list and expected a competitive match. It's a genuine tactical philosophy, and the Imperial Guard community holds it with the same intensity that other factions' players hold tournament standings. The Leman Russ battle tank, the Imperial Guard's primary main battle tank, named after Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, sits adjacent to this culture as a different kind of absurdity. The naming coincidence alone has generated significant community entertainment. Leman Russ, the Primarch, is one of the Emperor's genetically engineered sons, a figure of essentially demigod power, leader of the Space Wolves Space Marine Legion and chapter, and canonically associated with wolves and wolf imagery in every aspect of his visual design and lore. The tank named after him is a squat, wide, heavily armored box with a turret mounted on top. Community threads are said to have explored the logical conclusion of the naming coincidence with escalating commitment. Leman Russ the Primarch, perched atop the Leman Russ battle tank, was described as sitting there like an enlarged cat on a death Roomba. The rift chain that followed is said to have moved through enlarged space corgi, consistent with the Space Wolves' wolf imagery filtered through a particularly British comic sensibility, to Leman Russ, a pun that requires about half a second to land, and eventually arrived at abnormally sized furry. Each step in the chain is 1 degree further from the original image and 1 degree funnier for it. The exact threads where these phrases originated haven't been pinned down, but the riff circulates widely enough that the community treats it as established. This is what an active, invested community does with lore that presents them opportunities. The Space Wolves Primarch is, apparently, a very large dog on a very small vehicle, and the community would like Games Workshop to acknowledge this more explicitly in future publications. None of this. The phone call from Australia, the 7-launcher manifesto, the Cyclops handshake, the Primarch on Roomba debate appears in any Black Library novel. The fiction output of Warhammer 40,000 is vast, covering thousands of years of in-universe history across hundreds of volumes. It contains galactic-scale wars, demigod conflicts, and the kind of cosmic horror that takes multiple trilogies to fully explore. What it doesn't contain is a chapter about the player in New South Wales who called a hobby store in England and fired a missile at a stranger's Chaos Space Marines while the receiving store watched. The greatest moments in this game's history weren't written. They were lived, in stores with carpet that needed replacing, on tables that were slightly too small for the armies being placed on them, by players who understood that the rules were a framework rather than a ceiling. Which brings the discussion, eventually, to the Baneblade. The Baneblade is the Imperial Guard's super-heavy main battle tank. It's enormous. It requires a special detachment slot to field. It has multiple weapon systems and a physical footprint on the tabletop that prompts opponents to recalibrate their expectations of the entire game. By any reasonable measure, The Baneblade is one of the largest and most destructive ground vehicles in the Imperial Guard arsenal. Community lore holds, and here the research record is explicit that no codex, no novel, no White Dwarf article has confirmed this, so take it as the community lore that the civilization which originally designed the Baneblade's standard template construct classified it as a light reconnaissance vehicle. The STC in this telling was drawn up during the Dark Age of technology, a period when humanity's engineering capabilities dwarfed anything the modern Imperium can produce. Whatever the people of that era considered a heavy tank was apparently so far beyond the Baneblade that this building-sized super heavy, with its multiple battle cannons and layered armor, represented to them something you'd send ahead of your actual army to check if the road was clear. Games Workshop hasn't confirmed this. The primary source record doesn't support it as a codex fact, but it circulates as established truth among 40K players, and it's easy to understand why. It completes a picture. The Imperium of Man is an institution defined by catastrophic overscale. Its soldiers die in numbers that make traditional military casualty tables meaningless. Its weapons are named after demigods. Its artillery has no maximum range. And its light tank, if community lore is accurate, is a machine that would flatten a city block without registering in the relevant vehicle classification system. The Deathstrike Missile Launcher fits perfectly in that picture. A weapon with a 960-inch range, deployed by a player in Australia against a game table in England, fired by telephone, after a dice roll that might not succeed at all. That's not a broken rule. That's the Imperium of Man made manifest in miniature form. Disproportionate, operationally unreliable, capable, on the right day with the right roll, of reaching further than anything sensibly should. The loophole closed with 8th edition. The range mechanic was redesigned. The phone calls stopped. The codex moved on. The stories didn't. A Facebook post from the community doesn't give a date for when it happened, just the era. Pre-8th Deathstrike had unlimited range. Call up a game store on the other side of the country. Let some filthy chaos player know you're, and then the text truncates because the important part has already been said. You call the store. You let them know. The rest is math and dice. There's something genuinely worth noting about the era this exploited. Not the rules loophole, but the cultural moment. Hobby stores in the pre-social media landscape were closed communities. You knew your local players, you knew the regulars at the nearest rival store, and beyond that, the game's world got hazy. The phone call exploit cracked that isolation open. It established that an Imperial Guard army in Sydney had theoretical jurisdiction over a game table in Birmingham, and that the community's response to this discovery would be enthusiasm rather than outrage. The receiving stores didn't object. They rolled dice. They reported results. They became part of the story. That is an unusual community. Most games, when a loophole this absurd surfaces, produce arguments, letters to the publisher, tournament bans. This one produced celebrations. The 7 Deathstrike Missile Launcher list that inspired the sending a message sentiment wasn't a competitive entry. It was a philosophical statement delivered in miniature form, and the community recognized it as such. The 4-launcher cross-state strike that allegedly triggered store-wide celebration wasn't a tournament victory. It was a shared event, a communal experience involving players who had never met and would probably never meet, connected by a rule that didn't know when to stop. This is the game the Imperial Guard community was actually playing, under the game printed in the codex. Not a competition for victory points, a competition to generate the best story. The Deathstrike Missile Launcher, with its 80-foot effective range and its dice mechanic that made it potentially inoperable, was the perfect instrument for that competition. Too unreliable to build a winning list around. Too spectacular to leave in the transport case. One shot, potentially never fired. Theoretically capable of reaching another hemisphere. It was practically designed to be used this way, even if no one at Games Workshop intended it. Whether the Australian player exists as a specific documented incident or as the representative figure of a broader practice that happened across many stores and many phone calls doesn't ultimately change what the story means. The community kept it alive because it captures something true about the era and about the army. Imperial Guard players were never the faction that showed up with the finely tuned competitive list. They were the faction that showed up with 7 Deathstrike Missile Launchers and a philosophy, or a Cyclops demolition vehicle and a suicide plan, or a phone number for a hobby store in another country, and the particular confidence that the rules permitted exactly this. The first rule of warfare, as the community frames it, is to have fun. The second rule is that if the codex says 960 inches, then 960 inches it's, and the player in England had better brace for impact. Drop your most chaotic tabletop war stories in the comments below. The archive is open.